Hello and welcome from Bogota, Colombia, to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by latamlist.com. If you like this podcast, you'll enjoy Latam List's daily tech news reporting. Sign up for the mailing list to get the weekly email update. My guest today is Joao de Paula, co-founder of Glio, the first Latin American startup to go through Y-Combinator all the way back in 2013. Originally from a small town in Brazil, Joao moved to Rio and was trained as a lawyer before deciding he wanted to get into tech. After partnering with a former professional poker player and the creator of Brazil's biggest poker website, Joao taught himself to code and co-founded Glio, a Yelp for Brazil. We covered the Glio early days, raising money and applying to YC before finally getting in. We talk about his advice to Latin American founders on applying to YC, preparing for the interview, and getting the most out of the program, and how they worked on the business through multiple pivots before finally deciding to wind it down after 7 long, hard years. Joao has great perspective on the region. He's been part of Brazil's ecosystem since its very early days. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey Joao, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
No, I thank you, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here in Crossing Borders.
So where are you in the world today?
Sao Paulo. So I've been sharing my time between Sao Paulo and San Francisco throughout the last year or so. But right now I'm in Sao Paulo.
Awesome. And what are you working on these days?
So I'm CTO and a member of the founding team at Origin Financial. We are a financial wellness platform that helps freelancers and people who actually have normal jobs to get their financial wellness, to get their financial life on track.
Awesome. And are you targeting the Latin American market, the US market, global market?
We're going for the US market. But after I joined, we started looking for a place to set up our technology team. And honestly, I just had access to such good talent here in Brazil that it just made sense for us to set up our offices here. But the business team's still in San Francisco, so that's why I fly back and forth between here and there.
And for people who don't know, what's it take to get from Sao Paulo to San Francisco these days by plane?
Well, 18 hours. Unfortunately, I think a couple of years ago, the direct flight that was from Sao Paulo to San Francisco got shut down. So you always have to do a connection, and that means you have to go through customs elsewhere and stay for 2 or 3 hours in Miami or Dallas before you go to San Francisco. So it usually takes 18 to 20 hours if it's a fast flight.
Yeah, it's brutal. I keep telling governments that if they would just subsidize, even if it's 1 flight a week or 2 flights a week to San Francisco from their home country, it would increase investment in the region by a big amount.
Yes. It's amazing how much investors go and visit their companies in Mexico or even in Colombia, I think, just because the flights are way faster. If you want to go and visit a portfolio company in Sao Paulo, well, you were screwed.
Yeah, no, I think the only city in Latin America that has a direct flight to San Francisco these days is Guadalajara and maybe Mexico
Wow.
City. But everything else is you've got to stop in LA or Miami or Dallas, and yeah, it's just not ideal. But enough of that. We'll jump back into your story first, and then we'll talk more about your business. Where are you from originally?
Yeah, I'm from the countryside of Brazil, so a small city close to Sao Paulo, but I grew up in Rio, so I'm a Rio guy.
And when you say the countryside, like how many people more or less lived in where you grew up?
30,000?
Oh yeah, so a real small city.
Yeah, it's a real small city, but I moved to a slightly bigger city when I was very young. I stayed there until I was 10, and then I moved to Rio. So Rio is like 15 million people now, so it's quite a large city.
Yeah, that's definitely going from the countryside to the big city. So did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur, or was this something that came up during your career path?
I think it came up during my career path. Obviously, in hindsight, when I look back, I see the signs there. When I was a teenager, I was always like starting these random projects, writing books, writing articles, setting up small websites about my hobbies. But there was no ambition there to like make money out of anything. It was just things that I wanted to do in my free time because honestly, school was just not interesting enough. When I was also like really obsessed by having an impact, but when I was a teenager, that just translated into a lot of interesting politics. So I made the classic stupid choice when you're interested in politics, which is getting into law school.
And what was it like being someone who was interested in doing businesses, but and kind of entrepreneurship and doing things, but also going into law school?
Oh, I got into law school. I just wanted to have a big impact. My turning point was when I started working as a lawyer, and a couple of years in, I realized that I had no impact whatsoever. I was just executing someone else's decisions, someone else's strategies, and that was just really, really frustrating for me. So after a couple of years, I was just getting out of college, and I decided that I wanted to do something else. I had some save some money, and honestly, I didn't have a clear idea what I wanted to do with my life. That forced me to just go back to my hobbies. So I started writing again. I started getting into websites again. And I was really, really lucky because that was around the same time that one of my best friends, Roberto, was starting what would become Glio. So Roberto, he has a very different background than I do. He was a professional poker player. He started what still is, I think, the biggest poker website in Brazil. It's kind of like a Yahoo for poker here. It's called Mais and he had recently sold it. He wrote a book about poker, but he wanted to get out of the poker game and just start companies. He realized that his passion was in starting companies and not having a specific poker website. He was starting to work on what would become Glio, and I was starting to think about dropping law school altogether. And we went out for drinks, and it just made sense. He pitched me, and he said, "Well, I've always wanted to work with you, but as a lawyer, you didn't have much use for an early stage startup. But if you're willing to do anything else, I would love to make this work." So that's how I started out.
And anything else besides law to make it work? And now you're ended up on the tech side. How did that transition happen?
Yeah, that was quite a long transition, I think. It lasted for at least a year. So we started out in September 2011. We got incubated in an incubator in Rio, and we were working with freelancers at the point in time to build our product. We were building a platform for local reviews in Latin America, specifically focused on Rio initially, so we could build like a significant mass of reviews. And we were working with freelancers to build this website, but it just wasn't fast enough. We usually took our entire day to build a product spec, decided what we wanted to do, and then we would hit them up, and it would take them a day or two to make some progress. They would come back to us, and it was never what we exactly wanted. And honestly, it was just not moving at the pace we wanted to move. So we started interviewing people to become our third co-founder, someone technical that could lead that side of the team. We started talking to people we trusted, and to some people that we didn't know, and it became apparent quite quickly that the people we already wanted to work with, they had their own issues and they couldn't join the project at the time, and the people that we didn't know and that we just didn't have the trust there to make the relationship work. So we just said, well, screw this, let's learn ourselves. My co-founder Roberto, he focused more on the design side, and I was quite lucky. I got extremely sick. I had to stay at home for 2 or 3 months, and I just took that time to read a bunch of books. I did a couple of online courses, and when I came back, I started coding. And obviously, it took a while, but over time, I got good enough that I could lead our engineering team and started hiring people to help us.
And when you were learning how to code, how did you do it? Did you read books? Did you take online classes? Get apprenticeship from somebody? How did you make it happen?
I think all of those at different points in time. So I started out reading books. Um, then I did a couple of online courses just to get into the specific framework we used, which was Ruby on Rails. And then from there, I was quite lucky to just run into people who were really good programmers and that were willing to rent out their time to me and help me understand the different concepts. But honestly, like I think people just overrate how hard it is to build a simple app and to build the smallest version of something people want. And I think that after I don't know 6 or 12 months, I was pretty good to do what we had to do on the early stages of the company.
So, hear from lots of non technical founders when they start. There's only a very few that are able to teach themselves to code and actually build the product themselves. What would be like the number one hack that you would tell somebody to do if they are in that situation today of not knowing how to code and not wanting to depend on a third party? What's like the quickest way to get going to teaching yourself?
I think that right now you have a lot of options. When I started to learn to code, which was the beginning of 2012, you didn't have Lambda School, you didn't have all this um, online courses, you didn't have boot camps, so it was really, really tough. I just bought a couple books that people recommended to me. I read through those, didn't learn much, and then I went to the online courses and started just hacking something together. I think that the most important thing is getting your hands dirty. After you learn a little, you can probably start to understand what's going on in the system you want to work with. And if you try to build something on top of it, you're just going to learn very, very, very fast. What I honestly think that really helped me was just that we had users, and that was an enormous forcing function, which was they wanted product. They wanted us to build the product they wanted, and we didn't have anyone else to do it. So that just forced me to get my heads down and honestly just work probably more than I should, 16 hours a day to do that.
So what was the Brazilian startup ecosystem like back in 2011, 2012? At that time, I remember I was working with a Chilean startup and we looked at opening up an office in Sao Paulo and saw that it was actually more expensive than New York back in 2011. What was the ecosystem like back then? And what was the country like in 2011 when you were starting to do this?
Yeah, it's interesting because the country took a downturn, but the startup ecosystem is probably 100 times better than it was. Um, there was just no funding. The few investors that we had back then, they were interested in companies that were making money from day zero, or they wanted a huge chunk of the company for a very small amount of money. We actually tried to raise money from a couple of investors before we got into Y Combinator, but it just made no sense whatsoever. We were just going to become employees overnight. So I think that really improved. Also, the fact that we have a lot of exits that happened after the period of time, that really helps with hiring. So there are a lot more people that realize that they can make money and that they can get rich and they can get liquidity for their work and for their shares by working at a startup out of Latin America, and they don't have to leave their families or their friends behind to do that. So that I think was really, really important to get the ecosystem going.
So you mentioned you talked to some investors and they were you'd end up basically being employees quickly thereafter. Like what kind of terms were they offering? What kind of stuff did you run into back then in 2011?
Oh, a lot. So I think there was an investor at some point in time that offered us 100,000 reais, which is probably, I don't know, $40,000 at the today's exchange rate for a majority share of the company. So it just wasn't doable.
And what made you make the jump besides we're not getting doable deals in Brazil? What made you make the jump to go and try to get into Y Combinator when there hadn't been a Latin American company into it yet?
Oh, we always tried. We tried, I think, 4 times before we got in. Um, when I started to get into startups, uh, right out of the gate, the Paul Graham essays were my top resource. I just love his writing. I really enjoy his thinking process, and I think Roberto did as well. So for us, from the beginning, we were just like, well, it it costs zero to try, and actually, the application process really really helps. It forces you to make this honest look into your company, into the progress you made, into your market, and try to position ourselves for success. So we started applying right after we started working together. So we applied on September 2011, and we obviously didn't have anything. We didn't have a product. We didn't know how to code. We didn't have users. We had zero traction. So that was a clear no for them. We applied again in the first semester of 2012. And at this point in time, we had launched the product, but I was still starting to code and we didn't have many users. When we applied at the second half of 2012, I was coding full time. We had launched the product, but our growth just wasn't there. But in early 2013, we were just spreading like wildfire, and we were coding. We were starting to gather the small team, and I think it just made more sense to them.
And in any of those three previous applications, did you make it to the interview phase, or was it always just a straight no?
We didn't make it to the interview phase. We just got the rejection emails. Actually, we were almost running out of cash by the time we got the interview call, and we were quite lucky. Roberto, he never got into Hacker News, but he got in. a random day. I don't know why. And there was a program message to him asking him to send our growth graph. And we did. And if we had missed that message for a couple of days, I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have gotten the interview, and we would have run out of funds. So we got that message. We replied. They asked us to go to San Francisco, and at this time, the amount of money that they reimbursed us for the tickets was just not enough. So that if we didn't get in, we would definitely have to move into consulting, and that would have meant the end of the company after a while. So we literally bet everything we had on that interview.
Ended up being a good bet. So what was the interview process like back in 2013, and did Latin America and being operating in Latin America come up in the interview?
Yeah, that came up. So we were doing a product that was quite similar to Yelp. So the obvious question was, why is not Yelp in Latin America? So we always had to answer that question. And we also had some bigger competitors that were doing the product here, but I just don't think that they were doing a very good job at adapting the product to the Latin American ecosystem. So we got into the interview, and I think that the interview process didn't change that much. It's still quite quick, 10-minute interview with some partners. This was still quite early days for YC. This was the last batch before they made the jump to 100 companies. So we were interviewed by Paul Graham, Jessica Livingstone, Trevor Blackwell, and Robert Morris, which are the YC founders. And it was really, really fast. So PG started asking a bunch of questions, what we did, how big was the market, how fast we were growing. Trevor, I think, pulled up his MacBook and started looking at our product, making questions about some of the decisions we made. He started comparing our product to one of our competitors, and that was it. We were out. And I was almost sure that we didn't get in. So we were very, very surprised and extremely happy when they called us a couple hours later, asking us if we were willing to let them invest.
And did you know, and did they know at the time that you were going to be the first company from Latin America in the program, or was that something that came up after the decision was made?
Oh, that came up afterwards. I don't think they really cared about that much. We were obviously quite proud when we realized that was the case, but we weren't sure beforehand. We knew that none of our friends or none of the people we knew were able to get that, but while YC was not such a big network like back then, so we weren't sure that was the case.
What advice would you give to other founders when either thinking about applying to YC and then once they get to the interview process?
I think that the advice for people that are considering to apply to YC is just apply. Like I said before, it's such a good exercise on company building to be able to take a step back and think about the stage you're in, how fast you're growing, what's the market you're going after, how is the relationship between the co-founders, does the equity split make sense? All of the questions that they ask during the application process are really, really, really good and really thought out. I think they experiment with it every once in a while and add new questions, remove old ones. And I think it's such a precise way of thinking about a business that it's a great exercise for any entrepreneur to take. After you get the interview, and then another tip is just reaching out to YC founders. I probably help a dozen companies every 6 months with their application and with the interview process, and generally coaching them on positioning themselves well for the partners. So I think that that's a very, very good advice. If you make to the interview stage, I think reaching out to YC founders becomes even more important because doing mock interviews is the best way to learn about the process that is going to take place in those 10 minutes. Also, like just positioning yourself as someone who will be successful even if YC doesn't invest generally helps, but that I think is probably a very good general fundraising advice.
And how about once you get into the program, what would be your advice to get the most out of YC or any other accelerator?
Yeah, I think that advice depends on your background, but if we're talking about Latin America, I think most Latin America founders come from a scarcity environment. So we grow up getting used to trading our time for money. So if you have to run an errand, you go do it yourself. If you have to go take a bus instead of Ubering somewhere, you go and take a bus or you walk there. And after you get into YC, you have literally 3 months to put your company in the best position it can get to have a shot at raising money from investors. So you need to get out of this scarcity mindset and put the money that YC invests to work so you can get to demo day in a very, very good spot. So that's the most important advice that I would give to a Latin American founder. The other advice, I think that in the first YC dinner, they always tell you to write code, talk to users, eat, sleep, and exercise. When I did YCombinator, I definitely focused too much on writing code and talking to users, and I didn't sleep, I didn't eat well, I didn't exercise, and it's a marathon. It takes a toll on you. It's very, very intense 3 months, which you have to focus 100% on it. So just taking a step back once a week and taking care of yourself is quite important. And the last feedback that I would have for someone who's in that position is to pick the partner well. So there's YC has a lot of partners now, and it's really, really important for you to pick one or two with which you have a rapport and that understand your space, understand your company, and people that you can generally have conversation about deep topics and that can track your progress through time.
And so what happened with the company as you finish YC, you do demo day? What happened next?
Yeah, so we started the fundraising process. We raised $1.5 million, and we got into this huge dilemma, which was: do we go back to Brazil and stay close to our customers, or do we stay in Silicon Valley and stay in touch with Y Combinator and the other investors and our batchmates? We ended up making the decision to go back to our users, which was a very, very good one. Also, because we just had access to such good talent here. You can hire people that work for top companies like Google, Basecamp, Facebook, just because you're a pretty good startup for the ecosystem here, and you can pay market rates because you raise money in dollars, and they just get generally excited to work at a Silicon Valley startup. So that's a huge advantage that Latin American founders have, honestly, over any founder that doesn't have access to that incredible pool of talent.
And so you closed the 1.5 million. What was that like raising money as a Latin American founder in the Valley? Did you have uh, an experience that you'd say might be different from someone who wasn't doing business in LATAM, or questions that were out of the ordinary, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, I think that the key question is the key problem is that people or American investors in general just don't really understand outside markets that well. So I think you have to make a much better job at explaining your market and explaining why that makes sense and why it's a large opportunity. If we were doing the same thing in the US, we probably wouldn't have had to answer that question so many times. So you have to do a good job educating people on why what you're doing matters at all. Um, Also, I think there's more of the question, which is like, well, why doesn't American company X, Y, or Z isn't doing that in our market? And you really have to get into the nitty gritty of explaining why Latin American is different, why the culture here forces you to have different products, and why you can defend yourself against those companies when they do decide to go into Latin America.
So there was a recent article or a series of articles in TechCrunch over the last couple of weeks about why accelerators, especially YC, have gone from being one LATAM company in 2013 to, I think there was 8 or 9 in this last batch. Along with the same time, I think the TechCrunch headline is, why is Andreessen Horowitz and everybody else investing in LATAM suddenly? What have you seen change in the market from when you were raising money in 2013 to today that makes that change interesting?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think that intrinsically the American investors are getting more interested because they realize that they could have big exits here. So I think that the Rappi case, the ride-hailing companies case, that really, really helped. I think that American investors are really aware that they can make big exits in Latin America just as big as they do in India or in the European market. For entrepreneurs, I think that honestly startups just got more hip throughout the past 5 years. It's now a much more accepted career path, and failure is becoming more acceptable as well for your families or your close ones. So I think it just makes more sense for entrepreneurs to do that. Also, the the digital formation of the continent is really different from the United States. People didn't have their first contact with the internet through computers mostly. They did it through smartphones. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs are just young kids who got into smartphones after 2008 or 2009 when the iPhone started shipping to Brazil. And now they're getting all the know-how that they accumulated for all the past 10 years and they're devoting that to starting companies.
So, what happened with the company after you raised the money and decided to go back to Brazil?
Well, you want the long story or the short story?
Whatever you want. We've got all the time in the world here.
Okay, yeah. So we came back. We built a very, very good team, and we started working on that product and iterating quite fast. And after a year, I think, after we raised money after YC, we we had, in my opinion, probably the best product in that segment. We were competing against Yelp. We were competing against all these different startups, and I honestly think we had a very good product, but it just wasn't taking off. And we started thinking about that, and we came to the conclusion that the market just wasn't big enough. We were building this product for ourselves. Me and Roberto, we're just the kind of guys that reads review about everything. So I read reviews about forex, about movies, about books, but that's not the standard Latin American person. Most Latin Americans, they just don't have enough discretionary income to go out enough to use an application like that enough, so we could build a big enough company around it. And we had this commitment inside Glio and to our investors that we were going to try to build a very large company, and that just wasn't possible in the market we were in, or it wasn't possible in our field. So we still had most of the money we had raised, so we started looking around and looking for opportunities that we thought were good enough for us to try out. And at this point in time, we were still alone, the only Latin American company in YC. So every single time that a founder had a problem here, they would pick up the phone and call us. And we started listing the reasons why they called us. And by far, the biggest reason they called us was sending money back and accepting payments in Latin America, particularly Brazil. And well, you have been living in Latin America for a long time now, so you probably know how complicated the payment market is here. You have bank slips, you have transfers. Most people don't have credit cards that can pay US dollars. Most people don't have credit cards, period. So in Brazil, you have this phenomenon where people are used to paying installments, and all of that were things that people just didn't know about, and they didn't call us to learn about the market. They called us to get to a solution, and there was no solution to point to, and we realized we could become that company. So we started to build something like a Stripe for American companies to process payments in Latin America and send that money back. This was 2014, so the country was growing quite fast. We had the World Cup, the Olympics were coming over. We were in the cover of The Economist, so it just seemed like this perfect opportunity where you have more and more innovation coming out of Silicon Valley and more people going out of poverty and started to buy these services online. So we realized we could build a big company there. We started researching that space, but it turns out there are huge legal barriers to doing that, and we just didn't want to cross some lines that it seemed we had to. So we realized that that was a huge problem, but there was no founder market fit. But in the process of researching that product and working on to build that technology, we talked to a lot of companies that were really, really good at selling foreign goods inside Brazil, but they were generally terrible at direct to customer and marketing. And we realized that there was a huge opportunity for us to stay closer to our core competency, which was building software, doing customer support, talking to users, and just delegating all the logistics and the importing stuff to these companies. So we pivoted into becoming an e-commerce marketplace for Latin America. This was probably right after the World Cup in 2014. And that was a problem that we worked on for the following 4 years. So we were quite obsessed from the start to build a large company, and that meant not making sure that our costs were not raising as fast as our revenue. So we devoted a lot of time to automating every single part of the company. So we built our own ad tech. So every single time a supplier added a new product to the website, we automatically bid on that product on a number of different platforms. We did our own customer support software. So we went from zero to millions in GMV without having to hire a single customer support representative. So we were quite serious about that, and we managed to get to profitability actually. But as we were talking before, Brazil took a huge downturn, and our growth kind of stalled. And we realized that we could become a mildly successful company, but we wouldn't be the home run we were working towards. So after a while, we just decided to wind the company down and focus on the next big thing.
Winding a company down is many times the right decision and something that I think people in the US are more willing to do than in Latin America. When I talk with a lot of VCs around the LATAM region, one of the main topics is kind of the zombie companies that probably should
Mhm.
just be wound down. There's no pressure from the investor to try to get a return, but the founders still keep going at it to try to make it work. How were you able to decide to wind it down, and what advice would you give to companies and to other founders that are maybe in that similar situation?
That's a very, very good point, and I agree with it 100%. We were never pressured by our investors to close the company or return the money. They were always extremely supportive, so I have absolutely nothing to complain about. I think for us, it was just a matter of realizing we had tried as hard as we could. We worked extremely hard for 7 years, and we didn't have the energy required to do another turnaround. We had a few ideas on how we could turn Glio into a huge business, but that would require us to go back to the drawing board, fire probably 90% of the people that worked with us at that time, go back to investors, try to raise some debts or some money on terrible terms, and try again. And that just doesn't look like the scenario we wanted to be in. So we were just had the very, very honest conversation between the two of us, me and Roberto, that we would rather save ourselves the extreme burnout that would come from such a situation and just live to fight another day.
What lessons did you learn? Say top two or three lessons in that 7 year business kind of odyssey that led to the winding down that you use today.
That I use today? Well, I think there are a lot of the startup advice is quite generic, but it makes sense that way. I think that hiring can never be understated. It's so, so important to find good people. And I think that after we raised money from YC, we ran the company for around 4.5 years. And most of the people we hired stayed with us for long, long periods of time, some of them from the beginning until the end. So I cannot understate how important it is to go out there and try to find the best possible people you can and keep them close to the company. And that means rewarding them well. And I think a lot of Latin American companies do a terrible job with equity in general. I think they realize that a lot of startup employees in Latin America don't expect to be offered shares, and they just don't do that. And it sucks, honestly, because that means that people are less incentivized to stay with the company, and that means that if it turns out that you build a successful company, they won't have the money to go out there and help the ecosystem afterwards. So I would definitely advise you to reward your employees accordingly and pay them market rates and let them be able to lead their financial lives while they work at your company instead of just grinding them out until they burn out and leave your company forever. The other advice that I would make is to look for bigger problems. I think that's an advice that's coming up in the US as well. Obviously, Peter Thiel argues for that on Zero to One that you should focus on important problems. But I think that's even more important in a market as LATAM's. We don't have the basic infrastructure that's required to run businesses here. We don't have the basic infrastructure to hire people, manage them. We don't have the building blocks that Americans take for granted there, and that's obviously a bummer. But it also creates a lot of opportunity to build those building blocks and be the company that offers those services to other companies. And I think you're seeing more and more companies that are not becoming copycats or getting ideas from American companies, implementing them here before the American companies manage to come into the country, but are starting to come up with ideas that are specific to Latin America and that could be only created here. And more, I think those are overlooked ideas that you can get a lot of funding for, and that you can get people to really care about and dedicate their lives to build that alongside you.
So once you decided to wind down the company, how did you decide to get right back into a startup again?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I actually took some time off. I probably spent 6 months doing nothing, just reading, getting back to some habits that I wanted to get back into. And I think around May or June last year, I started to talk to friends, talk to some founders that I knew, and talk to some companies that I admired to understand what I wanted to do next. It was clear to me that I didn't want to start something brand new right out of the gate. I didn't have the energy to do that straight away. So I started talking to some people that I knew that were had just started companies, and it became clear to me that I wanted to be on this very, very early stage and help a company go from zero users to Series B or C, which was something that I didn't do at Glio. So on this process, I started talking to Matt, who is the co-founder and CEO at Origin, and it just made a lot of sense to work with him. I didn't want to, even though I wanted to work at early stage companies, I didn't want to work with inexperienced founders. And he already had started a company in the insurance business in the US, so he was very familiar with that business in the fintech space. He also had raised money from reputable investors. He knew what he was doing. He had already hired some other folks for the core founding team who really, really added to our capabilities. And it just made a lot of sense also with my background. So I I had to do a lot of fintech issues and building fintech products at Glio. And I think that it even appeals to my regulatory background as a lawyer. So it just made sense to work together. And that's what we did. I started working at Origin around September.
Awesome. And you mentioned in the beginning that Brazil is an interesting place to build a tech team. Tell me a little bit about why that is and why is Brazil a great market for tech people?
Well, first of all, it's a very large country. So you have over 200 million people in this country, and a lot of them are studying programming or are engineers by training. So there's a huge talent pool here, and honestly, they're just not rewarded as they should. As we were talking before, most startups are not offering them good compensation. There are very few startups that can afford that. So now you have like Nubank and Rappi and all those companies that are getting bigger. But for the average Brazilian programmer, working at a startup was just not feasible until a couple years ago. But there are some very, very good ones. They're working at big companies. Some of them are working at boring jobs, and they would love to go do something riskier or work at a more interesting space. And so I just started reaching out to friends, got some recommendations, and started building the team here.
Awesome. So if you could go back to when you first started your first company, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
Mm, that's a tough one. I think that the most important advice that I would give myself is to really make sure you make the big decisions right. So devote a lot of your time and leave a lot of your time going over those things and doing reality checks on all the big decisions around your company. So product market, pricing, and acquisition channel. Those are probably the four most important decisions you can make at your company, and you should always be reviewing those and making sure they make sense instead of just working 16 hours a day on execution. The other thing is probably scaling myself faster. I think as founders, we are usually attached to the company and attached to the business, and we want to oversee things and be part of every single decision. But you just need to over time understand that you need to scale your decision making process, and you need to help people take care of the business for you and take over some of the responsibilities you have from the beginning, and just own that. And that means you need to write a lot, you need to work on culture, and you need to hire people who you can trust to take over all of those different things. And I think we did that at Leo, but I would definitely have done that way before if I knew what I know now.
Do you have any books, blogs, podcasts, documentaries that you like to recommend to people, whether it's about entrepreneurship or just life in general?
On entrepreneurship, this core takes care of itself. I think it's a very, very good book about leadership and about how you make a very strong team in general. Um, there are a lot of entrepreneurship books, obviously like Zero to One, The Hard Thing About Hard Things are really good books. I think that the technical side is quite important if you're getting into tech. So I'll definitely advise you, even if you're not technical, to understand how technology works and what's possible and how it behaves. So read some algorithm books. Architecture books are quite helpful. Clean code. You obviously need to know some code to get into that, but it's really, really helpful to make good day-to-day decisions. Um, the Paul Graham essays, I think we talked about that before, but those are just gold. And just follow people on Twitter. I'm off every single social network you can find, but Twitter is just too good to be true when it comes to building technology startups. There are a lot of people, Naval, Mark Andreessen used to produce a lot of great content. They're just there, and you can have direct access to them and to their minds.
So, what's next for you in the business?
Yeah, I want to build Origin to a large company, man. That's what I'm committed to. I want to start something new, probably in a couple of years, but right now I'm 100% focused on this.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to tell your story. It's super interesting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Joao de Paula, Latin America's first entrepreneur to go through YCombinator, paving the way for more than 30 who have gone through the program since. If you like this podcast, please share it with a friend, and please give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen to your podcasts. Big thanks to Cody here, who wrote us our latest review, thanking us for our show notes, which are written by Angel, Sofia, and Josefina. Thanks you three for all of your help, and thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day.